Hey everyone, PV here, and welcome to my new YouTube video. In this week's video, I'm going to talk about the 3 best decks to craft for standard right now that will remain viable after the rotation. This is one of the things I get asked the most about during coaching because people want to have a deck that is good now, that I can play with now, but that is not going to become obsolete as soon as the next rotation comes in. Because, in about 2 months, give or take, there's going to be a new Magic set, the new Innistrad set, and when it enters standard, a bunch of old sets are going to rotate out. And these old sets, Turn of Eldraine, for example, is one of the most powerful sets we've ever seen. So a lot of the cards that are foundational cards of current standard decks are no longer going to be legal, which means entire archetypes are going to disappear. So people don't want to feel like they, spend a lot of money in wild cards, spend a lot of time chasing down those cards, spend time practicing a deck that is no longer going to exist in 2 months. Take, for example, Sultai Ultimatum. In my opinion, Sultai Ultimatum is the best deck in standard right now. So if you ask me, what deck should I craft? I have a tournament I have to win tomorrow. I would say Sultai Ultimatum because I think that's the best. But the main card in the deck, Emergent Ultimatum, is going to rotate out in 2 months, right? So the deck is not going to be legal anymore. There's going to be no semblance of a Sultai Ultimatum deck anymore because the main card in the deck is not going to exist. So if you craft that deck now, you have 2 months to use your cards, right? So that's not the best choice for someone who's, building a collection, who has limited resources. It is much better to craft a deck that will remain viable and where the rest of the cards will also remain viable. Because not everything in the deck is rotating out, but a big portion of the deck is. So there's no guarantee that you'll even be able to use the cards that don't rotate out, because there might not be a home for them. The same is true of all the adventure decks, right? Because the whole adventure package is rotating out. So for example, Aggro Innkeeper, Lustric Beast, Bunkersha Giant, Brazen Borer, these are all going to cease to exist in standard. So if you craft an adventures deck right now, it's very likely that you're not going to be able to use a lot of your cards when the new set comes out. So the goal of this article is to tell you 3 decks that you can craft that are competitive right now, that are good right now, and that will remain good and viable after the rotation, so that you don't spend your wildcards on something that you're going to use for 2 months, right? The idea is, yes, you're going to spend some wildcards to create these decks, but these cards and these archetypes will remain viable after the rotation. So you're not going to create a card you're going to use for 2 months, you're going to create a card you're going to use for years. And obviously, there's no way to guarantee that this is going to be the case, right? Because there is a new set coming out, we don't know what's in this set, and this new set could just be busted, right? It could be very, very good, it could have, a lot of different synergies that make certain cards better or worse, and there's no way to predict that. But to the best of my ability, these are the decks that I believe are good right now and will remain good after rotation. The first deck I have for you is Mono Green Aggro. And Mono Green Aggro is a deck that I believe is tier 1 right now. I think it gained enough cards that it's now one of the better versions of aggro decks that you can have. It is better than both Mono Red Aggro and Mono White Aggro, for example, and obviously much better than Mono Black and Mono Blue Aggro, which hardly exist. So if you were looking for a straightforward aggressive deck, I think Mono Green is probably your best bet. And the reason the deck is good right now, and it wasn't very good before, is that it gains 3 very good new cards. 2 very good new cards and 1 relatively good land. Right? The first very good new card is Ranger Class. And Ranger Class is, it's dubbed by many the best card in Adventures of Forgotten Realms. Right? And if you don't know what it does, it's effectively a 2-drop. Right? But unlike the other classes, it is actually a 2-drop because it comes with a 2/2 creature. So you just pay 2 mana, you add something to the battlefield, which the other classes do not. And then you can pay 2 more mana to turn it into your own Luminary Aspirate, so to speak, right? You get to attack and pump a creature every turn. Then, once you pay 4 mana, you got a Vivian passive, right? Vivian Monsters Advocate passive, which means that you can grind anyone at any point, right? You're never going to run out of creatures if that card stays in play. And unlike Vivian, it's an enchantment, so it's actually very hard to remove from play. And Ranger Class is a card that is already good right now, but will be even better in the future because the control decks will not have the ability to so easily go over the top of it. Because right now, the premier control deck of the format is Sultai Ultimatum. And Sultai Ultimatum is a deck that you're not super interested in grinding out, because at some point they'll cast Ultimatum and they'll just kill you. They don't necessarily win every time they cast the Emergent Ultimatum, but they win most of the time, regardless of what else is going on in the game. So, spending a lot of mana to trigger this ability, to then start playing cards from the top of your deck, might not be fast enough to kill them. But once Sultai Ultimatum rotates out, we might have control decks, that resemble more traditional control decks, like Demir and Azorius. And these decks, traditionally, have a lot more trouble with an enchantment like this, because they cannot just kill you out of nowhere. So they have to take control of the game, and this card doesn't let them do that, right? As long as this card is in play, it's impossible for them to retain control of the game. So they have to find a way to kill you, which I think makes this card quite powerful. The second card that the deck got is Werewolf Pack Leader. So Werewolf Pack Leader is not special like Ranger's Class, but it is still a very good card, right? It's a 2-mana 3/3 with 2 relevant abilities. It's not that hard to trigger the first ability. And the second ability, sometimes you have leftover mana, you just activate it and you get some extra points of power and trample. Right, so this card is quite good. It is one of the reasons Mono Green is now a much more viable deck than it was before. And together, this card shore up the biggest weakness that Mono Green decks had before, which was the 2-drop slot. Right? I remembered I tried to play Mono Green for a while, but the 2-drop slot was always so bad. Right? You just didn't have enough good cards to add to play on turn 2, and you always had to end up playing some suboptimal stuff that made your curves a lot worse. So now you have 2 actually great 2-drops, which increases the power of the deck a lot. And the third card you get is Lair of the Hydra. Right? Lair of the Hydra is a creature land. It's similar to Faceless Haven, but it adds green mana, right? And because it adds green mana, it's much better to play with stuff like Old Growth Troll or the Werewolf Pack Alpha. And just, if you draw 2 of them, you don't have mana problems, which sometimes you do with Faceless Haven. If you've played Mono White or Mono Red, that drawing 2 Faceless Havens is sometimes a problem, right? Which doesn't mean you can't play Faceless Haven. You still can play a couple, but Lair of the Hydra just gives you another option for that slot. And I think the best build will probably have both of them. And Lair of the Hydra is actually a pretty powerful land, right? It takes only 1 more mana for it to attack for as much as Faceless Haven, and we know that that is a lot, right? And sometimes you just have 7 mana, then you get a 6/6 attacker, right? That's pretty powerful. So just having this flexibility in your land slot is really good, and it makes the deck more resilient to sweepers, which are traditionally something that is very good versus Mono Green. Right? Mono Green doesn't have a lot of haste creatures, for example. It has some, but not a lot. So sweepers are a problem for it. And these creature lands are one good way of solving that problem. Ranger's Class is also a good way of solving that. But, this card just get your opponent dead, and having access to another one on top of the one that already existed can be pretty valuable. Then, once the new set comes out, some of the things are going to be gone, right? For example, this deck is playing Lustric Beast, right? That's an adventure card. It's not going to be legal anymore. But it doesn't need that to succeed. The core of the deck is still going to remain viable. So this is already a deck that is good in Standard 2022. Right, the main cards that I talked about that were responsible for revitalizing the archetype just came out. So they'll be legal for a very long time. So I think this deck is a pretty safe crafting, right? If you are looking for a deck that is simple and easy to play, that is currently very good, and that where most of the cards will remain good, at least the main concept will remain good after the rotation, I think Mono Green Aggro is your best bet. The second deck I have for you is Izzet Dragons, and that is a deck that I didn't like very much before the new set, but I think I actually got some really interesting new tools that make it better in this particular format. And then, most of the core of the deck remains for the next format as well. The new cards that he gained are first the new dragon, Imrith, Desert Storm, or something like that. That's the 5 mana 5/5 that has Ward 4, and then when it attacks, it deals damage, you draw cards until you get to 3 cards. And I think that card is quite good. It is obviously not as good as Dragonlord or Jutai was back in the day, right? That was one of the best cards in Standard, but still fills a very good role of something that you can just tap out for without worrying about what's going to happen to it very often, especially once Heartless Act rotates, right? It hasn't rotated out yet, but, it still costs a lot of mana to kill that with a simple removal spell. And it turns on your dragon synergies. There will be some in the new set. And it's just a good beater that complements the deck quite well. So I think that card is pretty good. And it will be better once the format rotates because there won't be any Heartless Acts, there won't be any Mystical Disputes, which is its most natural predator. So I think right now you play 1 or 2 copies. But then down the line, once the deck rotates out, you can play, 3 copies, for example. And the other card, which is the big reason I think the deck is better now than it was before, is Burning Hands. Because originally the deck had a couple problems with big green creatures, right? Lustric Beast, Elder Gargoth, Pelucrinus, Coma, and all of those die very cleanly to Burning Hands. Before then, there was no way to answer these cards permanently, right? You had to either counter them as they came out, or you had to Brazen Borrower them back to their owner's hands. But that was just a delaying tactic, right? It didn't work very well with Lustric Beast, for example. You bounced and it just got a token and replay it, right? So having the ability to kill them dead for 2 mana at instant speed is very valuable, and I think catapults this deck to, tier 2 or tier 1 even. I think that card really just makes a very big difference to the playability of this deck right now. Now, a lot of these cards will rotate in the next format, right? So you won't have to worry about them, but right now you do. And Burning Hands is the reason that this deck is good both now and later, because now you have the tool to answer this card. It's obviously very good versus the mono green deck that I just talked about. And some cards will rotate from this deck as well, right? Bone Crusher Giant and Brazen Borrower are the 3 most important ones, I think. And they are meaningful, right? They are very good cards in the deck. But I think the deck can survive without them because it changes its style a little bit. Right now, it's sort of a combo deck, right? It wins the game as a combo deck a lot of the time because you play Brazen Borrowers at the end of the turn, then you attack and play Arden's Epiphanies, gain extra turns, attack for more, and you kind of kill them out of nowhere, right? And the Giants and Brazen Borrowers help facilitate that. When you don't have these cards anymore, you're just going to have to play other reactive spells. Instead of Bone Crusher Giant, you play Dragon's Fire, for example, which is a dragon synergistic card, right? That, it's better with Inrith, and Ghost Pendragon works with Faceless Haven as well. So I think that card is potentially quite good. So you're just going to play that in your deck instead of the Giant, which limits your ability to kill people out of nowhere, because again, no more Brazen Borrower, no more Flash Threat. But instead, you just play more of a mid-range style with the 5/5 dragons. So your deck is getting a little bit worse, yes, but every deck is getting much worse, which is why I think this deck can still remain and be competitive. And the core of it, a lot of the cards in it, a lot of the expensive cards in it, are going to remain legal. Like Goldspan Dragon, Arwen's Epiphany and stuff, those are all going to be legal. Faceless Haven. So I think it's a pretty good bet. And the third deck that I have for you is a little bit of an outside shot. I don't think it's as good as the 2 decks I talked about. It's not tier 1, it's not tier 2. It's probably a tier 3 deck at this point. But I think it has the ability to be good in the right metagame, and it has the ability to be very good after the rotation, right? And that is Mardu's Sacrifice. I think this deck is super fun to play. I really, really enjoy it. I have played it before the new set, even in the game. Quite a few new tools as well. The first card that deck got is Shambling Ghast, and I think this card is unassumingly one of the best cards in the set. It's actually really, really strong for a 1-drop, because sacrificing it is so easy nowadays. And you get 2 very relevant abilities, right? So when your opponent has a 1/1 or a 1 toughness creature, you just kill that. That's great, right? You're killing a creature basically for free, because you want to sacrifice your 1-drop anyway, for whatever effect you have. Well, and if they don't, you get a treasure, which, speeds you up, fixes your mana. And alongside the other card that you gain, Deadly Dispute, it means that you can very easily splash a 3rd color. So whether you want to play, just Extas, the Avatar of the Blood, whatever card, or something like Showdown of the Scouts, which the deck runs in the 2022 version, you can do that because you now have 8 ways of generating treasures effectively for free. And this is a deck that is normally quite good against the creature decks because it relies on, stealing their creatures and sacrificing them for various good effects for you. But then if your opponent doesn't have creatures, it's not fast enough to pressure them, and it doesn't really do that much, which is why it's not that great a deck right now, because Sultai is arguably the most popular deck and the best deck in the format, and it doesn't run a lot of creatures, so it's not a creature-based deck. So this deck is not very strong right now, but it can win a lot if you spike the right metagame, right? So if you're playing against stuff like Mono White, for example, or even Mono Green, this deck is quite good because you just steal their big creatures and do whatever you want with them. Then once the rotation comes, you actually lose part of this identity, right, of stealing your opponent's creatures. The best cards at stealing their creatures are not going to be illegal anymore, but you still retain the core, sacrifice stuff, get treasures, and get benefits from sacrificing your small things. That is still a thing that is going to be doable after the rotation. It will arguably even be better after the rotation because you won't rely on them having creatures anymore, right? So you will be a little bit weaker versus the creature decks because you don't have the stealing cards anymore, but you will be stronger versus the non-creature decks because you won't require opposing creatures anymore either. Another reason for me to recommend this deck, even though it's not the best deck right now, even though it can be quite good in the right metagame, is that it's very cheap to craft. So it doesn't require a lot of rares or mythics. A lot of the main cards are commons and uncommons. Not many of the ones that are rares or mythics will rotate out, so you get to keep your cards for longer. And it is just a very cheap deck to play overall, I think. I think it has less wildcard demands than most other decks that would be viable in Standard. And it's even a good deck in Best of 1, right? Because you have the Eye Twitch and the Lessons package. You get to use your sideboard in Best of 1 in a much better way. So it's a pretty versatile deck that you can play in Standard 2022 queues. You can play in Standard queues normally. Or you can play in Best of 1 or Best of 3. and you will be able to play in the future, I think, at least, because the core of it will remain viable. So I think it's, again, even though it's not as good as Sultai Ultimatum, for example, if you're just looking for something to craft to get you going until the rotation, I think this is a good choice. That's what I have for today. If you like my videos and want to support my work a little bit more, make sure to check out my Patreon page. It's patreon.com/PVDDR, and there you can support my work and get some extra perks on top of it. And special thank you to my biggest supporters: Adam Risse, Adrian Camilleri, Daniel Luz, Foxy, Fernando Vizeu, Geoffrey Whitehead, Harley Quinn the King, Igor Petrov, Joey, Kevin Pang, Kevin Massey, Lawson, Mattia Giardini, Richard Gurgis, Sylvia Leticia, TJ Webb, Thomas Pokorny, and Dimitri. I really appreciate the support, and I'll see you next week.